I'm back. The last section of Playing in the Dark, it takes an interesting, what might seem like a really weird left-hand turn, right-hand turn, whichever direction you want to go, in which Morrison abandons essentially just the theoretical and really takes her theoretical idea and applies it directly, not to a bunch of different writings, but to to two pieces by Ernest Hemingway. And why Hemingway? Well, he's emblematic of a lot of things in the United States and in our literature, American literature. But the thing that he's probably most emblematic about is the American white male. There's been, he was probably one of the most, well, he was one of the most influential writers of the 20th century. His style, my friend Bob Barsanti, who teaches English like I do, says he doesn't make language less, he dehydrates it, which I think is a beautiful description of what Hemingway's style is. He takes most of the adjectives and most of the adverbs out of it. His sentence is generally very clear and bright and at least seemingly not complicated, although that's really not true. He's a remarkable writer, and yet, like many remarkable writers, has some significant flaws and significant issues. And of course, people's views change about things like race and how race ought to be represented. People's views change about the use of the N-word, which was, again, casually thrown around by white writers. We've seen it with Robert Penn Warren. We see it with William Carlos Williams in the epigram Today. He doesn't say the N-word, but he uses a trope of black women as dangerous to young boys, young white boys, that would be. We see Faulkner, we see Twain, all writers, all white males who felt perfectly free and permitted, privileged to use the N-word. Twain uses it for different purposes than the others, including Faulkner, but there's great debate over whether that word ever ought to cross the lips of a white person in any circumstances. I never use it, even when I'm reading out loud. I substitute the N-word or I just pause. I don't feel any privilege to use that word at all in spoken language or in reading or in writing. If I was to write a story, a novel, I would never privilege myself with the use of that word. It's just too atrocious. There's in fact a book where that word is the title, and then it's the history of a word. I can't think of the name of the author, but you could look it up very quickly. But it discusses the history of that word and why it is such a horrendous thing. Why does Morrison spend so much time talking about Hemingway, and particularly this one novel? It's not even Hemingway's greatest novel or his best known novel, To Have and Have Not, in 1937. I think because it's emblematic of what language does. As a way to lead into that, I just want to reread for you directly from a piece of paper the opening two paragraphs that you're writing about Invisible Man. I am an invisible man. No, I am not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe, nor am I one of your Hollywood movie ectoplasms. I am a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. Like the bodiless heads you see sometimes in a circus sideshow, it is as though I have been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass. And when they approach me, they say they see only my surroundings themselves, or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me. Nor is my invisibility exactly a matter of a biochemical accident of my epidermis. That invisibility to which I refer occurs because of a peculiar disposition of the eyes with whom I come in contact. A matter of the construction of their inner eyes, those eyes with which they look through their physical eyes upon reality. That's the metaphor that Morrison is talking about right there. I am not complaining, nor am I protesting either. It is sometimes advantageous to be unseen, although it is most often rather wearing on the nerves. Or again, if you often doubt if you really exist. You wonder whether you aren't simply a phantom in other people's minds. Say a figure in a nightmare, which the sleeper tries with all his strength to destroy. It's when you feel like this that, out of resentment, you begin to bump people back. And let me confess, you feel that way most of the time. You ache with a need to convince yourself that you do exist in the real world, that you're part of all the sound and anguish. And you strike out with your fists, you curse and you swear to make them recognize you. And alas, it's seldom successful. I'll never get over those paragraphs. So keep that in mind as I go through the next 10 minutes or so. What Morrison focuses in on is the precise way that this character, Wesley, in To Have and Have Not, the man who is baiting the hooks for the men who are deep sea fishing off the coast of Florida here, how he is dehumanized by the language that is chosen. And Morrison's very careful here to make a distinction that all critics should make, that there is a distinction between a writer and his or her characters. You can write a racist character and not be racist yourself. All you have to do is to be able to understand the mind of a racist, to understand their thinking, and then represent that honestly on the page. But that doesn't mean you yourself are a racist. Are Shakespeare's characters in The Merchant of Venice anti-Semitic? Yes. Is Shakespeare anti-Semitic? Not so sure. Hard to tell. Does he use stereotype? Yes. But Shylock is one of his most sympathetic characters in some ways, even though he's a bitter old man. We like him on some levels. And if Shakespeare hadn't drawn him in some way as a sympathetic character, then he would be nothing but a stereotype, nothing but a caricature. And he's certainly anything but that. He's a fully rounded human being. We understand him. So, is Hemingway a racist? Well, if you read some of his stories, you're awfully sure he is. He uses the N-word like most white writers did at that time, loosely and with privilege, or assumes that he has the privilege to do that. But what were his feelings really on race? Well, you'd have to ask a Hemingway biographer about that, and that's a different story. But he understands how language is used in order to humanize and dehumanize Wesley at various times in the novel. She points out that the first part of the novel is written in the first person, so from Harry Morgan's point of view. And throughout that, he refers only to Wesley, only by the N-word, except when speaking to him. And then he calls him Wesley. He doesn't say, hey, you, N-word. So he's sensitive enough to know that you don't do that out loud, but when you are referring to him to another white man, or when you're thinking about him, that is the word that Harry Morgan's brain chooses, the N-word. But it also sets up a distinction, and Morrison is very careful to point this out, between the man, by which she means either or of the two white men on board the ship, on the boat, either Harry Morgan or the wealthy client, the person that's been brought along to do the fishing. They are men. Wesley is the N-word. Go back in your mind to that slide that I had. It's the opening slide in my PowerPoint, where you have the restrooms. You have one for men, one for women, one for colored. It's the same dehumanization, that if you are colored, you are not a man or a woman, you're just colored. So here it is again in a piece of literature. Here is one of our great writers who's either aware or not aware of this, and that's what's so hard to unpack in Hemingway. Is Hemingway consciously doing this, setting this up so that we, the reader, will see this fine and subtle point? Or is he just writing the way that an American male at that time is thinking? So does this reflect the culture, or does it reflect someone criticizing the culture, someone taking the culture on and asking us to see this? I don't know. It's very hard to tell in that. But the point is how language is used in this book. I'm going to read part of a paragraph here where it becomes very clear how this works. The problem is how to acknowledge the first sighting and continuing the muzzling of this N-word, who so far has not said a word. He's kept silent throughout the book, and at this point he's kept silent again, even though he's the person who spots the fish, the flying fish at the prow of the boat that are signaling, this is where we're going to find the food, or find the big fish that we want to catch. He's still kept silent. He is not allowed to be the person whose voice we hear shouting, "Hey, look." And we get to this peculiar sentence that Morrison points out. The solution is a strangely awkward, oddly constructed sentence. The N-word was still taking her out, the boat, and I looked and I saw he had seen a patch of flying fish burst out ahead. He saw he had seen. Well, as Morrison points out, how do you see that somebody has seen? I mean, you could see them pointing and gesticulating, and and if the boat is going in a high speed and the waves are splashing, maybe you didn't hear him yell or something, but he might be looking back. But none of that is given to us. It's only, I saw that he had seen. Again, dehumanizing him, not allowing him any voice, any gesture, any part of this, other than the fact he's driving the boat, which of course is an important feature. And it goes on this way. In part 2 of the book, which is told in the third person, then the narrator takes over the use of the N-word. When the man, again, the man and the N-word, they're both men. But when Harry is talking to them, they've both been shot. There's so much emphasis on the stoicism of the white man on the one hand, and Wesley's complaining and crying and blubbering on the other hand. So you get this dichotomy of a man, white man, and a N-word, and the manliness, the stoicism of the man, and the whining, crying, complainingness of the N-word over here. I remember when I was a boy, we used to, every Saturday morning, they used to have Tarzan, these old, very, very racist movies from the 30s and 40s. Tarzan is this child, you probably know the story, but he's this white child who's abandoned in Africa, and he's raised with the apes, and blah, blah, blah. And the other people, of course, in the jungle setting where Tarzan and probably grows up with Cheetah, the chimpanzee, and all the rest of it, are, of course, African people who are black, except for the white explorers who come in constantly throughout these things. I remember this one Tarzan movie, and I couldn't begin to tell you which one, but where a bunch of white explorers, that's my dog scratching, Acer, stop, where a bunch of white explorers have been captured. Of course, there's a sole white woman so there's a sole white woman in this mix as well. Somehow she improbably goes along on this thing. We, of course, because it's a 1930s film, black and white, we don't see a rape scene take place, but we see her taken away, and we know that that's what's going to happen to her. I saw this when I was probably 8 or 9, and it's still so vivid in my mind. All of the white people are tortured to death, and along with them also are their porters, the African people from a different tribe apparently, and so they would be seen as enemies by the tribe of cannibals that kidnapped them. They're tortured to death as well. And what I remember being so impressed by, until of course Tarzan comes swooping in and saves the white people, some of the white people. Whether he saves the black porters is a different question, but certainly a couple of the white people anyway are saved by Tarzan, who's white as well. What stuck in my mind, and the reason that I remember this, and will probably go to my grave remembering it, is that the ceremony in which the people are ritually killed, the tribe that is of cannibals that has kidnapped them, captured them, has this strange bowing thing, and they have these big blades in their hands, and as they bow over, the blades apparently sink into the flesh of the person lying there tied on some kind of a table or platform apparatus. And as they bow over, of course, and these blades plunge into the chests and innards of the people, they die this horrible, painful, would be horribly and painful death. What impressed me was not so much that, although that was horrifying enough, but that the way that the actors are directed to behave during this, all of the white people that have this horrible thing happen to them remain stoic, like Harry Morgan. They grimace, of course, and they fight back there, but they don't yell and scream. But all of the African porters, who are just as black as the people who are killing them, writhe and scream, blood-curdling screams and terror and blah, blah. So the white people are stoical and can suffer, with dignity, and the black people just are like children and are ungovernable. And that's roughly the same time period that movie came out, roughly the same time period as To Have and Have Not. So that's part of the milieu of American literature and film at that time. The rest of the passage, or the rest of the analysis, the criticism of To Have and Have Not, comes to the bit where Harry and the third part of the book, where Harry and Marie are in Cuba, and a black man, who happens also to be a Cuban black man, who's not referred to as a Cuban, but referred to as the N-word, somehow insults Marie, or looks at her, or says something to her. Anyway, Harry slaps him, and his hat flies off underneath a cab. And so, it's like, even, as Morrison says, even the cars and the furniture are against African American people. They collude with the white people. That he's treated with a slap and not a punch castrates him, essentially turns him into a woman. One, in movies and books at that time, men didn't slap other men, they hit them. They slapped women, they hit men. And so that feminizes the man. But it also leads to Marie bleaching her hair, which is what happens subsequently. So she becomes whiter, if you will, or more Anglo-Saxon. And then they get in bed together. And so there's this connection between race, sexuality, and violence that seemed to make perfect sense to Hemingway when he's writing this book. And again, whether he's critiquing what he's seeing in his culture, or is just playing with those same tropes that other people were playing with at that same time, it's very hard to tell. It's just there. We have to notice it. And a book like Morrison's book helps us to notice it. It's one of the reasons that I use this book every other time I teach English 102. It points out something in our culture that is disturbing, but explanatory at the same time. It helps us understand why we are where we are as a culture, as a country, as a society, and why our literature looks the way it does, and why it contains or doesn't contain fully rounded African American characters, or African characters for that matter. Again, next week we're going to be looking at Heart of Darkness. We're going to be seeing some of these same issues emerging in that book, which is set in Africa in the tail end of the 19th century. And I may return at some point this week with another short lesson, but I'll just let you get on with your reading and look forward to reading your essays that are due on this coming Wednesday. You'll have one more piece of writing directly related to this book, which will be posted later this week. And until the next time, I will remain yours, and I'll see you all later.